I guess in my 52-year railroad career, I have walked to the moon and back on railroad platforms just like this in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And I've come to know there are a lot of untold stories and even a few secrets out there involving the railroad industry. Please join us and subscribe so we can continue to bring you those untold stories and even a few secrets from America's railroad past.
All aboard! Highball it, Eagle!
Have you heard the travel news about the Eagle Way? To your destination happening every day. The Texas Eagle is clicking on the rail. From the Windy City to the Alamo, meet you at the station, come on, let's go. People get ready and catch the wave. Catch the wave, the Texas Eagle Way. Through the heart of the nation of traveling.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my podcast. I've seen some trains before. This time we have the distinguished Mark Anderson Murphy, who went from railroad mailroom clerk all the way to vice president of Amtrak Intercity Services. I had the very humble privilege of working for, and even a couple of times specifically with Mr. Murphy, one involving Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison herself. We were in high cotton that day, weren't we?
Yes, we were. That's one of those days you don't forget.
You don't forget. Yes, sir. Mr. Murphy, by virtue of me asking you a few questions, I'm going to permit you, by your gracious leave, to introduce yourself. Tell us, down here in the South, we say, where were you born and reared? But where do you hail from? Where are you from originally?
Originally born in Newport News, Virginia, Tidewater, as the locals know it, or in the athletic parlance, it's area code 757. So you need to get heavily into college athletic recruiting to understand what the area 757 means. But there's a lot of people that live there. Second most populated area in the state of Virginia, I believe now. And there are an enormous number of highly talented individuals that colleges value, and they spend an awful lot of time recruiting the 757. So Newport News, Virginia,
Wow.
sir.
Sir, you've educated me. One thing I found, Mr. Murphy, in doing this podcast of the several I already have done, I'm surprised at the number of people willing to admit with no trepidation that they had a lifelong desire to always go to work for the railroad. I was just surprised that seems to be a common thread. Not everybody, but the majority so far. And I wonder, which side of that fence do you fall on? Was that a boyhood dream, or did it just happen?
It just happened.
Okay.
It just happened. And I can tell you how it happened.
Please.
Quite frankly, like so many of us at that point in time, the revenue stream had dried up and we needed a job.
Right.
In between my graduation from high school and the start of the first year of college, I went to work for a subsidiary of United Van Lines in what I believe is now known as Midway, Virginia. It's just outside Quantico, where the Marine Corps base and the FBI Academy are. But summer job, bunch of guys graduated with me. We moved furniture, and it was an interesting job. We were making a whopping $2.89 an hour back in those days.
Wow.
And on the weekends, in order to make a little extra money on the weekends, we would perform what are referred to as office moves. Well, and look, at that point in time, the office moves that we made most of the summer were at LaFont Plaza for Amtrak. And the lady that ultimately steered me toward HR, Ruth Lederer was her name, was our point of contact. And we'd get up there after close of business on Friday evenings, and we'd work pretty much the entire weekend moving furniture and stuff.
Question, if I might, sir.
Sure.
Were, ladies and gentlemen, LaFont Plaza in downtown Washington D.C. was Amtrak's original corporate home from
Yes, it
May
was.
1st, 1971, and for a couple of decades thereafter, nearly. But may I ask, were you moving new furniture for Amtrak into LaFont Plaza, or were you moving furniture within the corporation?
Within the corporation. There wasn't a whole lot new at that point in time, believe me. The
Okay.
new started as the company started to mature, but a lot of it was just moving. And remember, we're talking 1974 at that point in time, 75. So you were dealing with hiring, you were dealing with a brand new corporation,
Yes, you
and
were.
and there were two buildings in the LaFont Plaza footprint. There was the 955 and I believe it was 950, but everything Amtrak had pretty much at that point in time from a headquarters perspective was in those two buildings. And so there was a lot of movement taking place, and we'd work from close of business for Amtrak on Friday. We'd come up and we'd move offices around and boxes around and furniture around all weekend long, and so that when the folks came back to work on Monday morning, they were pretty much in their new locations. We did that all summer.
Yours is indeed a ground floor story
Oh,
of,
absolutely.
of
Absolutely.
helping to set up the corporation. Okay, so you were directed to an HR person at Amtrak.
Yeah, and whose name just escapes me at that point in time. But I went up and talked to Ruth, and at this point in time, the NESIP was just in its infancy. The Northeast Quarter Improvement Project,
Got it.
and remember, it was Penn Central there for the longest time, at least down on the southern end of the Northeast Corridor, and there needed to be a massive amount of money put into the corporation, put into the infrastructure, quite frankly. And in order to do that, there needed to be a large number of people that were hired, and I was part of that. Started on March the 1st, 1976.
March 1, 1976. Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing, if I'm guessing correctly, Amtrak's second president, Paul Reistrup, would have been in
Yes.
office.
Yes, Roger Lewis, I believe, was the first president. He was the only president up until the time I retired in 2017 that I had not met and did not know. But Paul Reistrup was at the helm in those days.
Okay, so on March 1st, 1976, you were hired to do what?
I was a junior clerk in revenue accounting. Griff,
Okay.
Amtrak in those days did not have its own ticketing system, and we certainly were in the infancy of revenue accounting. Griff, that was the longest 30 days of my entire career. That's all I'll tell you. We were over on the 7th floor, if memory serves, and try to picture those long brown folding tables, probably every
Yes.
bit of about 4 or 5 feet long. And we were in a big room, and we would sit there at these tables, and someone would bring us a pouch from a train across the system,
Yes.
and we dumped the pouch out on
Yes.
the table, and we literally counted every one of those tickets by hand. And so many of them from the host roads were handwritten, and you'd get that black ink and red ink and all that nonsense all over you. And that was my first 30 days on the railroad.
I've done this in a previous podcast, so for our viewers, forgive me for doing it again, but Mr. Murphy undoubtedly came across and read one of my handwritten tickets, and here it is 50 years later, and I still display it with pride. That's my ticket writing corn. I still have a corn right there on the inside.
There you go.
From because you had to bear down so hard to
Absolutely.
go, especially if it was a 4-ride coupon.
Oh, absolutely. And Griff, they come in little chits and you'd get the stub. And then they come in and look, the conductors and assistant conductors are doing what they had to do. But they would come in rolled up with rubber bands
Oh,
on them. And you had a little piece of paper that you would with the station stops and little boxes and you'd write numbers in it. That's how we accounted for the revenue in those days.
let me make a wild guess that I'm going to bet money on is true, because so it's really not so much of a guess, because in those years I was the agent at a division point, and I'm very familiar with those conductor pouches because I'm the one that they were remitted to me and I sent them in. But how about, and I only saw them from the conductors that I worked with. How many pouches did you encounter that had those illegible handwritten conductor notes, and you're sitting there scratching your head, what the heck is he trying to say?
Every one for 30
Everyone.
consecutive days. Every one.
Yes, sir.
You did the best you could. That's all.
You,
You know.
you surely did. And sir, okay, I do need to ask this question. Were my dear friends and perhaps your dear friends, uh, uh, was Ron Levine there yet in Revenue Accounting? He or close by?
He, for some reason, in the back of my mind, Levine, and this, fast forwards a little bit. Well, I used to deliver mail to various spots once I got to the mailroom, to various spots around the city of Washington, D.C. And for some reason, 1721 K Street was one of our satellite offices. And I remember a Levine that used to work over in one of those satellite offices. We were everywhere back in those days.
Was
Everywhere.
D Furman there yet? Who
That
became
I don't
head of
recall.
Revenue Accounting? Okay.
That I
All right,
don't
but
recall.
30
Go
days
ahead.
went by.
Well, you
And
had to when you joined. It was the Brotherhood of Railway and Airline Clerks, BRAC,
correct, correct.
and you had to. There was a stipulation that once you joined, you had to spend at least 30 days before you can consider moving on to another position that was available, if indeed it was available. So that's what the 30 days represents.
Having been a BRAC member myself, I had forgot. You are so right, sir. I had forgotten. So at the end of that 30 days, you said it's time. And so,
Griff, I was 19 years old. It was one of those, oh my goodness gracious, the clock never moved.
oh, I can imagine.
And I've got a lot of energy. I can't sit still today at my age. I could not sit still at 19. So I had to
Sure.
get out and get something that was a tiny bit more active. So that's what I did.
So you exercised your seniority, you took a promotion. What happened
I
at
took a
30
job
days?
nobody else wanted. At 30 days, you didn't have any seniority. Those days
That's
were.
very true. Very
So
true.
there were the mailroom, shipping and receiving. The reprographics area was in the basement area of LaFont Plaza. The job came up. Carl Murchie was running the show in those days, and he was an elderly gentleman that was probably getting ready to retire and was putting what time in he needed. But that turned out to be a very wise move on my part because I got to learn the corporation, at least the headquarters piece of that. Reginald Greenlee, who was in that area for the longest time. I'm not sure if Reggie still works there or not, but he may have retired. Larry James, and a number of others. I mean, Grip, these folks were the salt of the earth. They were just good. Took this kid under their wing and got past the number of stumbles that I made and such. But I learned an awful lot, and the most invaluable piece of all of this, there were two pieces. Number one, I ended up delivering mail to what was at that point in time, by the time we got over to 400 North Capitol Street in the early days of LaFont Plaza, because it wasn't too much longer that we moved over to 400 North Capitol Street. It got a little expensive trying to maintain two big offices at LaFont Plaza. I ended up delivering mail to the 8th floor, which was the executive floor. And in those days, just making the right, because you were dealing with all of the administrative assistants, all of the secretaries, all of the folks that kept all that stuff in line anyway. At that point in time, I don't think you were totally aware of it, but as time marched on, it became very clear who ran the doggone offices. It was the AAs and the secretaries and the EAs and my goodness gracious, those poor people never get paid what they're worth, because you would never consider doing any of that without them. They were just a godsend.
So what you're telling me here, I'm guessing, is you're confirming, in all of the Hollywood movies, the old Hollywood movies, no matter what the plot, but if it has a mailroom clerk in it, the mailroom clerk always knows everything that's going on, in the company. Is that the case here?
Absolutely. And you certainly understood who to go to get answers for anything that you needed. And Reginald Greenlee, I mentioned his name a few minutes ago, but Reggie was that he would be typecast as that individual in Hollywood today, because there was nothing that went on in any of the venues that he worked at that Reggie didn't know who to go to, what was going on, and had his finger on the pulse of just about everything out there. So yes, that was absolutely true. Absolutely.
So you daily you delivered mail to Paul Reistrup's office.
Yeah, Joel, to the secretary outside Paul Reister's office. Yes, but absolutely. And all of the other vice presidents and stuff. Tom Hackney and Frank Abate and all of the other individuals that ran the various departments that made up the entire corporation.
Is that how you met Mr. Reistrup? Is outside of his office delivering mail, or
probably bumped into him, or else said hello once or twice. Where I really met Mr. Reistrup, in that basement office, was his chauffeur, and that's where he set up shop.
The president of Amtrak. Did other Amtrak presidents in later years have chauffeurs? It's the first I've ever heard of that.
I don't know when that ended, but Mr. Reistrup did. Graham Plater certainly did. Alan Boyd certainly did. I don't know when that practice stopped, but when the individual who was the primary chauffeur, when they took vacation, they needed somebody to fill in. And I got an opportunity to do that on more than one or two occasions. So I did get a chance.
You were the driver. You were the chauffeur.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. This is brand new Amtrak historical information to those of us on my level. What I have to ask, was it a company car or was it their personal vehicle?
No. It would have been a company car, at least. I'm quite certain, like any fleet vehicles.
What kind of car? Top of the line?
Oh, goodness great. Well, it was. I want to tell you, it was a Buick of some sort, or a I want to say it was a Buick. But yeah, it was properly put out, obviously, but it wasn't what you envision as, with the bar and all that other stuff. It was pretty stark, but there was a phone in there for his use, and it was comfortable. You didn't go on any long excursions, believe me. It was just driving him around town and getting to Capitol Hill and to places that he needed to go when he needed to go there. But it was an interesting introduction. I did get a chance to meet Mr. Reistrup and obviously Mr. Boyd.
Yes, we'll talk about Mr. Boyd, who had also been Secretary of Transportation, yes, if I'm not mistaken.
He was.
Okay, but Mr. Reistrup, so you just for the historical record here, so I'm getting the impression you did not pick them up at home in the morning and bring them to work or take them home in the evening. That they did on their own. You just drove them in between.
There were occasions where, with their schedules being what they were, if you're in a meeting on Capitol Hill and it runs late and such, yes, they do need to be picked up. And at that point in time, you would take them by their place of residence and drop them off. And obviously check to see if they needed to be picked up the next day, and pretty much whether any deviations to the schedule that you were given had kicked in. So yeah, there were a number of times where I would drop the two gentlemen off at their place of residence after a long day on the railroad.
Ah, understood. So you were basically on call in that
Absolutely.
position.
You bet.
How long was it? Was it a 10-hour shift, 12-hour shift, 8 hours?
It totally depended upon what they needed done and when they needed to be where they needed to be. So
Wow.
it could vary. Your typical 8 hours, it could go 12, it could go longer. It was all dependent upon what their schedule dictated and what you needed to do.
Was Mr. Reistrup the type that would visit with his driver?
Oh, you chit chat back and forth, but most of the time he was busy doing, prepping for whatever venue he was headed to, and whatever meeting he had there, and occasionally one of the other staff personnel would accompany them. So that's when you learn to keep your mouth closed.
Yeah, yes, sir. I have to ask this question. While you were driving, did you have to wear a uniform like a chauffeur's cap, or just
Just a tie, coat and tie.
just a tie? Okay, then I have to ask, did you ever once driving along think for a moment, someday I'm going to be vice president of this corporation? Did that ever cross your mind?
No, I don't think it ever did at that point in time. That was stratosphere material at that point in time, Griff. I mean, I was way down the totem pole in those days.
Yes, sir. So how long did that last, Mr. Murphy?
Off and on, probably for about a year or two, something along those lines. And outside of the normal day-to-day duties that I had in the mailroom, and it just happened when the regular chauffeur needed some time off, and something came up, so you'd fill in.
I have to tell you a quick Paul Reistrup story. I met Mr. Reistrup at 3 o'clock in the morning at Texarkana one time when he was president. 21 southbound was pulling into the depot, but while he was still at track speed, before he got to Texarkana, a passenger jumped off the rear end of the train.
Oh boy.
And Mr. Reistrup, the conductor, went and woke him up, and as he should have.
Absolutely.
And said, "You're president of the corporation, sir. We've had a passenger jump off," and they even got permission from the dispatcher and backed up, and never did find it. But anyway, Mr. Reistrup and I met under those circumstances. But I want to tell you the end of the story, and then I know nothing else about it. They set this gentleman's personal belongings off at Texarkana because that's the nearest place where he had jumped. And
Sure.
are they going to find the body tomorrow or whatever? And I want you to know, the next day at work, 24 hours later, this bruised and battered and sourly dispositioned gentleman comes in and said, "That's my stuff over there." I said, "Oh no." I said, "It can't be." I said, "Do you know what happened to you?" And he said, "Well, I got too much to drink."
Oh, there you go.
And he said, "I went to the rear car and I managed to ease out and sit on the rear coupler of the rear car." And he said, "I rode that way a while until finally the wrong swing." He said, "Off I went." And I said, "Well," "How?" He said, I'd hitchhike." He said, "I walked over the highway and flagged somebody down." And I said, "Well, sir, I know it's been 24 hours, but can I offer you medical attention?" I'm going into the company mode here,
Absolutely. What you have to do.
And if you'll take a moment here, knowing the president of the company had been on the train, I said, there are a couple of accident forms that we need to fill out. I said, "We're going to make this as painless as possible." And he looked at me and he said, "We sure are going to make this painless." And he grabbed his stuff and disappeared into the darkness. I still don't know a name, a number, anything about that.
Those stories you can't make up.
You can't
No,
make
sir.
up.
Yeah,
No.
he does. That individual does not realize how lucky he was to still be able to stand on his own 2 feet.
And I never got to. So if Mr. Reistrup were to ever watch this video, Mr. Reistrup, I'm sure, would not would not have forgotten that particular event. So now he'll know. And Mr. Reistrup never knew the end of the story. Now he knows the guy didn't die
Yeah.
and came in and personally claimed his belongings.
There you go. Unbelievable.
So you were
Unbelievable.
still mailroom / chauffeuring when Mr. Boyd came along.
Yes, absolutely.
Alan Boyd.
I was in the mailroom.
Now, I definitely want to ask this. I had the privilege to meet Mr. Boyd on several different occasions. Was he, but I met him in political and social railroad circles. Behind the scenes, was he as affable personally
Yes.
and privately as he was the times I met him publicly? He just seemed to
Absolutely.
be.
Terrific gentleman.
Yeah.
Went out of his way to make you feel comfortable, went out of his way to engage you in
Yes.
conversation when he had the opportunity to do so. And that's something that you absolutely appreciate when you were sitting up there in my role, because I don't deal with the executives on a daily basis like that, or didn't at that point in time. So he was a tremendous gentleman, and I was very grateful that he did what he did.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe he was Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of
I
Transportation.
think he was. Yeah, I think he was. Yeah, I think he was. You could probably you probably know a little bit about that, more about that than I do, but that makes sense given the time frame.
Believe he was. Any specific Paul Reistrup or Alan Boyd anecdotes that you remember or wish to relate?
No, just in time, because I was born and raised in Virginia, was living in Virginia at that point in time, and at that let's see, if you've never been in the DC area, those who live there and call that home clearly understand what the Beltway is, and you've got your own version at various points in Texas. DFW certainly qualifies for that, but in those days, 495, that was the Beltway around Washington, both Maryland and Virginia, was in a constant state of repair. And it started out with a highway that handled an inordinate amount of vehicular traffic, and was 2 lanes wide. And it was just constant bumper to bumper traffic. And I asked him about that, knowing that he was the Secretary of Transportation, and as politely as he could, he said, "All I will tell you is that the folks who run the Department of Transportation in Richmond, Virginia, are not the most progressive people that I have ever dealt with in my career." And he let it go at that. That section it took forever, Griff, for that section of highway to finally get where it is today, 5 and 6 lanes wide, which it needed to do. It was just poor planning on the part of Virginia.
I've been on that in recent years. I cannot imagine it being 2 lanes both ways.
Oh, that was a mess.
I just can't.
That was a mess.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That was just a total mess, and I think some of that, and some of this is guesswork, but I think some of that had to do with the fact that Northern Virginia was looked at by the rest of the state as more a product of Washington D.C. than it was part of the Commonwealth. And the further south you went and got down around into Richmond and the central part of the state, the eastern part of the state, certainly the southwestern part of the state, that was DC. That was not the Commonwealth of Virginia. So trying to get things done for Northern Virginia was tough. It didn't happen rapidly.
I guess that's the true definition of all politics are local.
Oh, you better believe that. You better believe it, especially in those days.
So, what was the next step?
We were caught up at some point when Graham Claytor became president. We got caught up in his idea and his mandate to create efficiencies in the railroad and to treat it more as a railroad and more as a business as opposed to the initial 5 or 6, 7 years of the company's history. So he decentralized a whole lot of the functions that were currently in place at that point in time. and revenue accounting, for instance, revenue accounting, and I had left revenue accounting obviously many years before, but revenue accounting was a 500 person local. That prac local had 500 people in it. And when the decision was made to decentralize and send revenue accounting individuals and move that to Chicago and move it to New York and to places like
Right.
that, it didn't take long for that 500 person roster to get down into the 115 person range. And with the limited amount of seniority that I had accumulated at that point in time, we were looking for a job. I was fortunate to hold on to a material control clerk running the supply room there, because that was a partially accepted position. And I was able to do that for a few months, and then that fell victim to the same efficiency exercise. And what I ended up, that turned out, Griff, to be the absolute best thing that happened to my career. Because for that,
May I take just a moment here for our
sure,
viewers, for our non-railroad viewers, to define partially accepted position? What Mr. Murphy's referring to here, he took a job which, for lack of better terminology, he was half management and half labor. But the bottom line is he could not be displaced in seniority order.
that's correct.
He
That's
held the
correct.
job. He held the job permanently as long as he
Yeah.
wanted.
That's correct. Or until there was an action that took place there that the business basically required. So for a couple of weeks, once that job disappeared, for a couple of weeks, I ended up in I'll use the term limbo, but essentially furlough status. And I went walking into HR one day, shortly after that event took place, and spoke to an individual in there by the name of Bob Blunt. And I had met Bob as a result of all the work that I had done, through the mailroom and through other venues and other exercises there. And he was very frank. He said, "Look, I don't have any jobs here that are available." He said, "But we have a reciprocal agreement with the Washington Terminal Company, which had its offices at Washington Union Station." He said, "I don't know what they've got." He said, "But I will be more than willing to make a phone call, and you can go over and talk to those folks over there." I didn't have a job, Griff. I'll be more than happy to go over. I appreciate you doing that. And that started my work on what I will refer to as the real railroad, not headquarters, but what the railroad, typically everybody associates with that. So I went over there and I sat down and
So wait, so just to keep his history straight here for our learning purposes of your wonderful career, Washington Union Terminal Company, which operated Washington Union Station,
yes,
I think that's correct. It had not yet been absorbed by Amtrak. It was
that's
still
correct.
its own company, but it was running Amtrak trains or contracting. Amtrak had contracted them okay, go ahead. So
Yeah,
so
that's
I
correct.
did not. You've taught me something else of the many things I've learned from you over the years. Historically speaking, very obviously, Washington Terminal Company did not cease to exist on May 1st, 1971.
That's well, they may have. I don't know. I really
Okay.
don't know. They had been around for quite a while. Was the impression that I left, or that I was given when I walked over there, and such. But it took, I want to say, probably another 2 years before Amtrak absorbed the Washington Terminal Company. But the
Okay.
Washington Terminal Company had a history, and
Yes.
a big history.
A presidential history because of
Exactly.
its. Yes. Yes.
Exactly. And so I went over and you talk about lessons learned. Hindsight is the perfect vehicle. But I should have known at that point in time when I walked in there and spoke to the individual that was in personnel. The first comment that was made outside of, yes, we do have openings here, I can't offer you a supervisory position. And the thought went through the back of my mind, Griff, is that I don't know anything about what you folks do over here. Why would you give me a supervisory position right out of the gate? And I think a whole lot of that had to do with the persona that Amtrak headquarters carried with it. So I'm perfectly fine with not being offered a supervisory position. Well, it turned out that it was a laborer's position driving a forklift. Now, there were several of us that had a need for employment at that point in time. A couple that I had worked with, and we knew we went through the paperwork exercise, and you did what you had to do in order to get vetted and moved into the hiring phase, as we all went through a number of times. And I can remember going into this meeting. I remember it like it was yesterday. Sharon Spates was running that meeting. And she was not a shy, bashful individual, Griff. And basically, I have this job, I have this job, I have this job, and I have this job. I have 6 jobs, I have 6 people. This particular job is a forklift operator. It's got daylight hours. It has Saturday and Sunday off.
Wow.
And oh yeah, exactly. And you look around. Well, you and I understand what that means.
Sure.
And you look
on,
around
the railroad,
and,
it's unheard of.
exactly. And you know, she went around the room, and does anybody have forklift experience? Well, they started to my left and walked all the way around. Well, look, you know, it didn't take long for me to realize that if you wanted weekends off, Sharon, you know, it's been a long time since I drove a forklift. So, you know, I'm probably a little bit, I've never driven a forklift in my life, Griff, but I am
Right.
not going to turn down an opportunity to get Saturdays and Sundays off. So
Right.
I fell into the job and got that. Interesting story, first day on the job. So they told me where to report. I drove out there, parked off, and I'm in the, you know, I'm out at the terminal at this point in time, out in the yards. First time I'd ever been there, and went in and introduced myself. Walked into the office.
Are those the Ivy City yards?
Ivy City, yes, the original
Okay.
Ivy City. Nowhere, it doesn't look anything like it does today. I was there when
Right.
the new facility was built, but this was the old facility with the old round table and the old roundhouse and some of the best people I ever worked with were in that place, Griff. I wouldn't trade those days for anything in the world. But long story short, Vince Tana was the general foreman. Walked into the office, introduced myself. They went through the normal routine of getting everything set up, and the foreman, Foreman Hefner, we called him Big Daddy, big strapping individual, walked me out into the area that they held where the forklift was parked. And look, I'm just telling you, I'd never driven a forklift in my life. And we're talking about, and I talked to the gentleman who was there, and God rest Oliver Cohn's soul. He was running the wheel lathe at that point in time, but one wheel at a time. And the laborer, Larry Johnson was his name, I believe, if memory serves. The forklift was parked and the door was open just wide enough that if you knew what you were doing, you could get through the opening, you know, without hitting anything. Well, Bozo here had never driven a forklift. So and I've got quite an audience now, as you can imagine. There's 5 or 6 people wanting to know who this guy from headquarters
plus
is.
you're the new kid on the block.
Oh yeah, and from headquarters to boot. So
oh yeah,
you know how that right. Rumors on the railroad, they spread quick. So you know, so all right, back it out, Vince, back it out and put it out on the platform. We started back, got to the opening. I took the biggest chunk out of the bottom of that door that you had ever seen in your life. I bet that thing was 3 foot by 3 foot. And I just knew I was going to get fired. You know, I hadn't even been there 2 hours, and I'm going to be out of a job. So we finally got it out on the platform, and Vince, who was all of about 5 foot 8 inches tall, with that Italian heritage, had smoked a pipe, took that pipe, put it between his teeth, and he just looked at me and he looked around. And he said, you'll do, and stalked off into the office. And so, look, I worked all day long after that. That it was an inauspicious debut that only got worse 2 days later, when part of the job was to take the chip bin, and it was it was a bin, and
What is
Larry
a
was
chip? What is a chip bin?
well, they cut the wheels with the one wheel at a time in order to true the wheels. There was no wheel true back in those days. It was a wheel lathe. So,
Correct.
and Oliver Cohn was a machinist at that point in time. He would cut the wheels, and Larry would fill them up. And Griff, these things would come off in ribbons. It was ribbons of steel, and because they're steel wheels, and he'd load those things up into a dumpster, and that was the chip bin. And
Okay.
what came off in little tiny chips, literally, he'd scoop up with a shovel and load it up. And it was my job as forklift operator to pick it up, drive it down to the big dumpster, and dump it and bring it back so we could cut more wheels. Well, we second day, third day on the job, I learned two things. Number one, I learned how important safety was on the railroad, and how quick an accident creates opportunities to get better. So I picked the chip bin up, backed it up, drove it down to the dumpster, raised it up like you had to do at that point in time, moved forks forward just enough to create enough leverage, and there wasn't anything that you could do to dump it. It had a little latch there. So I climbed up on the forklift and steadied myself and popped the latch, and boom, it went over and dumped it out. Well, what happened was it's this index. I still have a scar. This index finger here just got gouged, chunk of skin taken right off, and you don't think anything about it. You wrap it up and drop the bin, put it back in, and started to drive it back to the wheel lathe. And the teacher, my trainer, if you would, oh, you can't do that. I said, what are you talking about? It's just a gouge. It'll be all right. No, we got to report this. I'd never been exposed to that before. Okay, so that
Right.
was, I learned at that point in time. So not only did I tear the door off or tear a big chunk out of the door on the first day of the job, now I've gotten injured. So they took me
A
down to,
reportable injury.
well, no, not yet. It
Okay.
turned out. So they drove me down. We had nurses in those days.
Right.
So we drove me down to the nurse down at Union Station. We're out in the yards, and took me down there. And she looked at it, and it was a perfect gouge. There was nothing. If you've ever worked with wood and seen somebody take one of those wooden tools and just gouge a chunk of wood out, that's what that looked like. Because there was nothing hanging, no skin, nothing. And it bled like you would expect it to do, but you wrap it up, puts pressure on it. So she cleaned it up and bandaged it up, and look, when you take a shower, put a baggie over it so the bandage doesn't get wet. So, okay, no problem. That's what we did. Came to work the next day. You thought I just walked off an alien spaceship. What are you doing here? So, what do you mean what I'm doing here? I work here. And the reaction to to my walking through that day was, because most people, as I found out later, most people would go ahead and take a day or two or three off. I hate saying it that way, but that was that was reality. So it was wrapped up, went to work, and it turned out to be a non-reportable injury. There were no stitches because there wasn't anything to stitch. I didn't miss any time, and it was cataloged, but it didn't count, because you remember how the worst thing in the world was a reportable injury. Oh, goodness gracious.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we're talking about here, it's the difference between, and I'm so glad it was non-reportable, because it's the difference between not hearing from your immediate boss or hearing from your immediate boss, what the hell are you doing, and why do you have a reportable injury?
Exactly. So it was non-reportable, and I think in order to because you remember what I found out later in my career, but you remember what the morning meetings were all about, because one of the first things you did in the morning meetings, you talked about, any injuries from the day before. Well, this had to get reported. And I'm guessing at that point in time, because it wasn't an hour into the shift and I'm working my job when the head of the safety department drives out there, gets out and comes out and introduces himself. So I guess to see for themselves that the knucklehead had shown up to work. But we did, and we were there, and the improvement that I referenced earlier, it didn't take another hour for somebody to go and make a makeshift apparatus that you could stand on the ground, slip over the latch, push it up, dump the dumpster, and then secure it back so that you could then carry on and get the dumpster back where it needed to be. So valuable lessons learned in the first 3 days as that labor. So interesting stuff. Interesting. But that's what we did for the first 3 or 4 months as a labor, and until such time as Vince took me aside, and we're talking 3 or 4 or 5 months. Learned a lot, Griff. Got in the pit with the Carmen and learned how to change wheels and helped the electricians with a whole lot of what they were doing, and the pipe fitters with what they were doing. Good way to learn. Would not trade it for anything. And then Vince said, look, he said, if you plan on staying over here, you might want to think about taking advantage of the apprenticeship program that Amtrak's mechanical department was working and had in place at that point in time. So took him up on the offer, tested out, and then became an electrical apprentice, and went through 736 8-hour days in order to get that certificate from the Department of Labor that I was indeed a full-fledged electrician. So
736 8-hour days.
And as if to say, who's counting? We all counted, because when you came out of that apprenticeship program, that's when your seniority started on the electrician's roster. So,
and I'm sure you had to take a test.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, you tested out as you went through there, because when you're talking in the neighborhood of almost 3 years. So
that's true.
You're talking a sizable point of time.
Another thing you've just taught me here that I've learned, one of the drawbacks of working in the environs of corporate headquarters, because you were talking about how the safety guy drove up the next day, so let me tell you what I heard. Okay, so the people that I only saw letters from actually came to you and wanted to know what's going on here.
Well, because
he was there.
Had a boss too. That individual had a boss at headquarters. Believe me.
So there's I don't know that the right word is drawback there, but whereas we in the field interacted with letters and responses to letters, you often interacted with the real people that were signing the letters.
Absolutely. You better believe it. And they came out again. Like I said, I still, it was to verify that somebody was telling them the truth, that this guy actually came to work and such. And introduced himself, had a good conversation, turned out to be a good, he and I were friends for the longest time after that. But like I said, the first 3 days, you learn a lot. You just didn't know it at the time.
So were you a locomotive electrician, a coach and sleeping car electrician, a catenary electrician, or were you could go anywhere they called you?
Yes, except for catenary electrician. Catenary electricians were members of the maintenance away department, but you were given exposure to that environment. And again, you talk about invaluable lessons. With 483 phase power, which is what we had on the cars and such. That catenary is a totally different animal, and you don't want to mess with that. And I saw both good and bad parts of that, believe me. But that you didn't want to mess with. But I worked on all of it.
Got it. Okay, so you're advancing through the ranks. Now you're a full field electrician, but that's a long way from vice president of long distance services yet. And I do want to ask this question, knowing you as well as I do. I'll bet when you were vice president, when you had occasion to walk the concourse at Washington Union Terminal, your beginnings didn't escape you. You could still see that forklift, and you could still see that wheel pit. I'll bet it never left you.
No, it still doesn't to this day. What it provided was an immeasurable value, because you could say that you had walked in the shoes of the folks that were, and look, listen, you know this as well as I do. As much as the executives want to believe they run the railroad, railroad was run by the individuals that were on the trains and in the yards and in those ticket offices. We had a saying, it is as true today as it was the first time I heard it. Trains will come in and trains will go out. It doesn't matter whether that executive or that executive is here. Those trains are going to come in, and trains are going to get filled with the passengers, and the train's going to go out, because the men and women who have those jobs understand clearly what their job is, and they do it. And that
so right, sir.
afforded me an opportunity to, as I continued to get different positions throughout my career, it afforded me an opportunity to be able to identify with so many of the men and women that were running the railroad at that point in time, and most individuals didn't come up through the ranks like that, and
No,
it helped me immeasurably. Like, you can't put a value on that. You really can't.
okay, what was the next step after electrician?
Well, we took a supervisory position, and then from there we were an ARSA supervisor for a few years.
ARSA supervisor meaning onboard service supervisor?
No, sir. No, ARSA also had, there were different branches of, there was ARSA M&E, and then there was the ARSA that you were familiar with through the onboard service side of the house.
That's the only ARSA I'm familiar with. So tell me about your ARSA, please.
Yeah, ARSA M&E was strictly maintenance of equipment. And
Okay.
I want to tell you, there's ARSA M&W, but don't quote me on that. I think someone else could probably verify that for you. But my world was ARSA M&E at that point in time. So that was the next step. And boy, one of those wonderful jobs. By this time, the new facility out at Ivy City had been built, the service and inspection building, and I had the dubious distinction of, again, no seniority again at this point. So you kind of roll it back. You take a step forward and 2 steps back, because you're a low person on the totem pole at that point in time too. I got the Tuesdays and Wednesdays off, working the 2 a.m. to 10 a.m. shift.
Oh, wow.
That we had, but again, you just, in hindsight, it was absolutely the best thing that you could have done, because it introduced, you're setting the next day's operation up, and you're working down at both in Ivy City and also at Union Station in Washington. You went where you were needed in those days, and not that you didn't have specific job locations, but if there was someone that needed some help at Union Station, and conversely out there at the S&I building, you get in the car and you drive out there and you do what you have to do. You learn so much. One of the first jobs I had, if I got to digress for a minute, one of the first jobs I had as an electrician when I became a full-fledged electrician was working the Metroliners. And I worked that, and when you work the Metroliners as an electrician, you were the only electrician in that work gang, and it wasn't a large work gang, but it was that work gang, and that was your train. And when you showed up to work, the midnight shift, when you showed up to work, that train pulled out at 6 o'clock in the morning. So that puppy had to be right. And Metroliners were the forerunner for today's Acela Express. And when we had issues with Acela Express and we needed to take that fleet off the road, it was the Amfleet One Metroliner cars that were put back into that service, and you didn't miss a beat with it because of how well trained the individuals were in making those trains as top notch. That was the first train to New York in the morning. New York had the same thing coming out. It was train 100 and train 101 coming out of New York. And that's where anybody who needed to get to New York in 2 hours and 49 civilized minutes, they rode that train out of the gate. So every executive that had meetings, Amtrak executive that had meetings in Philadelphia, that had meetings in Baltimore, and had meetings in New York, Penn Station, they were on that train, and they weren't bashful about telling you what they found when they got there. So great training. And then, of course, once you become a supervisor, because you had done that, you understood clearly how important those trains were, and making certain that you had the resources that you need in order to be able to get things done. And look, when the occasion came, you rolled those sleeves up and jumped in there and get help people out as to the best of their ability, because trains had to go. And it was as close knit an operation as I had seen throughout my entire career. There was a lot of pride, and it was Metroliners and Washington Terminal and Washington Union Station in particular took a lot of pride in what we did, and I think we did it as well as anybody in my career. No question about that. Proud of that job.
When you were the ARSA supervisor, were you supervising just electricians or all crafts?
No, all crafts.
All crafts. Okay.
As General Foreman Frank Cover said, on many occasions working that midnight shift, if I have questions, I'm not going to go knock on their door. He says, I'm coming to you. So it would be in your best interest to make sure you understand what's going on. Terrific lesson right out of the gate. So in order to do that, you couldn't sit in the office. You had to get out there and get on the cinders and work right alongside all the men and women that were getting trained, ready to go out the next morning. That's how you learn. That's what we did.
I'm just thoroughly intrigued by your story, Mr. Murphy, because so far, I know we're going to get there, but so far we're not on a path that normally leads to vice president of long distance services. So
no, that I got a break in that regard. We'll get to that at some point in time, but a lot of what I'm telling you laid the groundwork for being successful in those later years in the career. So I had an opportunity. There was a career development program through the safety department. Pete Canito was the vice president of operation. You remember Mr. Canito, and I think, if memory serves, Paul Cooley was the general superintendent, mechanical superintendent in Washington, in the Washington division. It was called a number of things, but Washington division was one of those things. Earl Stan Bagley was the general superintendent.
Mr. Bagley,
and
yes,
boy,
sir.
he took me under his wing a few times, gave me an opportunity, gave me some great advice, and kicked me in the butt when I needed to have my butt kicked. And
very knowledgeable
learned an awful
man.
lot from Stan. Oh, he was tremendous. He was tremendous.
I forget, wasn't he an ex-Pennsylvania Railroad man?
I don't know if he was or not. I can't. He may have been.
I
But
think he had
don't know.
railroad heritage. I believe he did.
I think he did. I know he was in the military and carried himself with that upbringing. Stan taught me an awful lot, and I was grateful for the opportunity to learn. We were proud of what we had on the Washington division at that point in time. Bill Duggan worked for Stan. Paul Cooley worked for Stan. And it was just, it wasn't the old school railroad. I mean, Amtrak was a military style organization in those days, with a definite hierarchy. But Stan ran it a little bit differently because he valued the input from folks. Was clear who was in charge, but he also valued the input from the folks who were down on the ground and solicited that. Lenny Greskowitz was the head of the transportation department. And boy, we had a terrific management team. But I got an opportunity, and the reason I brought Mr. Canito's name in there, when the solicitation went out across the country for folks who they thought had a potential for advancement, because that was, they're always looking at planning for that next wave of individuals that could be what we referred to as America's future leaders at that point in time. I was fortunate enough to be able to get an opportunity to do that, and they put you in the safety department at that point in time, because it was the one department that covered every other department out there. And so I did that for a little bit. I certainly learned how to interact with some government agencies at that point in time. And I only tell you this because the Amtrak's Ivy City yard was very close to the National Arboretum off of New York Avenue. And I only learned that after we got a phone call in the division offices one afternoon that we'd had a fuel spill, or we had a leak. And so the investigation took place, and out at Ivy City, there were very, very deep pits where the fuel tanks were buried. And I'm going to say they were probably 25 or 30 foot deep pits. And you can imagine the size of the fuel tanks. Well, lo and behold, once the investigation started, we didn't have a 3,000 gallon fuel leak. It was a lot more sizable than that. And the only reason we realized we had one was that the pit had filled up and the diesel fuel had leaked out onto the ground. And you were worried at that point in time. And, of course, you had to call the appropriate federal agencies. In this case, it was the EPA. And so someone came out and investigated. And what I didn't realize was the groundwater ran off into the National Arboretum, which had a waterway going through it. And what you wanted to avoid at all costs was being on the front page of the Washington Post the next morning.
Absolutely.
So you get together with the individual from the EPA, and you take your booms and you put your boots on and you roll out there. And as long as it took you to get the booms in position and to get the pads down and to do what you needed to do in order to contain the spill, that's what you did. And I can remember coming back into the Ivy City parking lot and at 9 or 10 o'clock that one particular evening, and the news reporters were monitoring scanners, and someone had gone out and had put it out that there was unusual activity taking place in Ivy City, and it was, look, no, you need to leave. And so we ran the reporters off, and there were lessons every step of the way, Griff, in that regard. And you learned what was important to a lot of these governmental agencies, and you learned to be collaborative, and you learn to do what needed to be done in order to get the job done instead of fighting them, as so many seem to think was appropriate. They have a job to do just like you have a job to do. So let's make sure that we're benefiting both departments and both entities at that point in time. So we did that. I had an opportunity then. I went in late 80s, 1990, 91. I went to work for Robert M. Burke's staff, mechanical staff up in Philadelphia, and that gentleman was as big an influence as any in my career. And I think you may have heard me say this once or twice, but I know I can tell you that in both our careers, there probably were one or two or three people that you probably would have worked for free for,
Yes.
and gone through a wall for,
Yes.
because of the way they treated you and what they taught you, and how they supported you. And Bob Burke, God rest his soul, was one of those mentors that taught me more invaluable lessons that stick with me to this day. He
And
valued.
you and I have one of those types of people in common. We would have both worked for Joy Smith for free.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Just they break molds when they make people like that.
They do.
And,
That's a wonderful way to say it. Now, when you were working for the mechanical superintendent at Philly, so were you at 30th Street Station?
yeah, I started off at oh, I want to tell you, we were downtown. I think it was 2000 Market Street, Griff. They created, they were making an effort at that point in time to try to create as many efficiencies as possible. And a lot of the stations, we owned. So let's turn a lot of the old offices and so many of these stations, turn them into office space and get out of the leasing that we were doing in a place like 2000 Market Street and such. So started at 2000 Market Street, but ended up moving to 30th Street Station. And I worked up there, fourth floor at that point in time, on the south side of the station, southwest side of the station. I think somebody that's more knowledgeable than me that'll see this and correct me, but it was on the fourth floor, and Bob Burke and Ken Cooper and Tom Scarpolino and Bob Brown and Harry Glambaki and Jerry Meskel, who went to Los Angeles and ran the mechanical department out there. Fred Nardelli was the individual that I worked for. I had worked for Fred and become acquainted with him in Washington before he went to work on staff. So that was the next step. Now, instead of being, having a local slant with the Washington division, now it was the national slant and the national viewpoint, and headed to Sunnyside Yard, and headed out to Chicago, and headed out to Los Angeles and to New Orleans. So you got exposure in those venues, and you got a chance to learn and meet the men and women that you had only heard their voices in the morning meetings and seen their name on distribution list. You go back to the cards and letters phase that you referenced earlier. Now you had a face to put with the name, and just wonderful people. Jeff Pierce in Boston, and Joe DeVito in New York, who had as strong a management team that you'll ever see, and hold those guys in high regard. Summer with the FRA today, Bobby Lavelle and Frank D'Angelo and a number of those guys introduced me to a lot of the things that I learned in those days. Always enjoyed going up there. The Philadelphia crew that was basically right down downstairs. The Marshall Berryhill in Chicago and such. Just tremendous people, and I learned an awful lot from all those folks. But I hadn't had an opportunity to. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You had a question.
No, my question. So you're now advancing through a line of ranks you never thought you would advance through. I mean, this was not a plan. This just kind of. You didn't go to work for the railroad and decide I want to work for the mechanical superintendent at Philly. It just happened that way.
Yeah,
Okay.
it certainly did. It evolved to the point where if I had stayed in Washington, the next step would have been as a general foreman. and this job, equipment manager, I think was what it was referred to. It was the same grade level, except this one had a national scope and would afforded me an opportunity to see the entire system as opposed to just what I knew in Washington, D.C.
Had you
So
met had you met our wonderful, I say our, meaning our Texas guy, had you met our wonderful Jack Pearson yet? Had he come on
I
your
met
scene?
I met Jack Pearson in 1983, 84, at the end of that, at the end of my apprenticeship program, we had an opportunity, and look, we were fortunate. Proximity is everything. You know, the location mantra in real estate. Well, this was the same in the apprenticeship program. I went through the apprenticeship program with a gentleman by the name of Tom Moore, and Tom was as goodness gracious, just sharp as he can be. I don't know whether Tom is still with the railroad or not. I need to do some checking on that. But boy, Tom and his brother John were just tremendous individuals. Well, Mike Lorello, who was in the engineering and mechanical department at that point in time, they were neighbors, and you know, as a result of the proximity to headquarters, before all of the engineering department and before all those folks moved to Philadelphia, they were headquartered right there in Washington, D.C. And in order to get a sense of who was coming through the apprenticeship program and give folks an exposure to a broader spectrum of information, we were given an opportunity to go through 4, 5, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, something along those lines, and went over there, and Mike and Ed Laird. You know Kurt Laird? Remember Kurt? Kurt's father Ed was over at the at headquarters there in engineering, and he was another one that that taught me a very, very valuable lesson, and I learned it the hard way. But that was the when I tell you I want you to do something, okay, I want you to do it. And it may not be the most popular thing going, but you need to understand clearly I'm giving you this directive for a reason, and I want you to follow through with it. And rest assured that if you follow directions, you've got all the support that you need in order to be able to go forward. So I have, in my vernacular, I've got your back. So, well, you know, goofball here, you know, didn't necessarily follow the directive the way he should have. And Ed was an old school railroad, which meant he wasn't bashful about telling you when he was unhappy with you. But he and I became good friends, and afterwards, as you know, he's up the food chain a little bit, and I'm down down a few rungs on the ladder. But his counsel proved to be invaluable. Mike's was as well. But I got exposure to those individuals and many others through that, and got an opportunity to go to New Orleans at the very end of that time at headquarters, and I took the train down and got off, and I met Jack Pearson, who was General Foreman Jack Pearson in those days, and became a lifelong friend, became a mentor, became someone that I really, really looked up to until the day he left us. And they just don't get any better than Jack Pearson. And Jack was always fun when I in the early 90s. He was in Chicago at this point in time. He had moved from New Orleans and gone to Chicago, and went out there for a visit. And Jack took me aside, and Jack, in his understated way, said, "You know, I can always tell the mechanical department employees from everybody else." And I looked at him, and he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Because you got a piece of luggage that has wheels on it, and you're carrying it." And okay, Jack, I
what
get
a
your
great,
point. So we set it down and raised the handle and did what everybody else was doing. But
right.
they didn't get any better, Jack Pearson. Jack
No,
Pearson was as salt of the earth as there was. Just another one of those individuals that you learn an awful lot with.
started out his railroad career as a Southern Pacific carman at Houston, Texas, which is when I first encountered him.
But you
And,
did.
and correct me if I'm wrong, but he went all the way to chief mechanical officer of Intercity at Chicago, if I'm not mistaken.
That is absolutely correct. Ran Beech Grove for a while.
Ran Beach.
Was one of the very few individuals, and I'm not sure there are many, that can honestly say that they've operated a locomotive and that they've run the mechanical department. And Jack, Jack had a saying, and you'll remember this if you knew him. Jack would look at you when you're interacting with him, and you'd make a comment, and Jack would give you that look that Jack had, and his comment was, "Is that right?" And we all heard him say that on many occasions. I learned.
Anytime. Is that
Yes,
right?
sir.
Yeah.
What I learned was Jack already knew the answer to the questions that had been posed. And when he looked at you and said, "Is that right?" He knew good and well that there was a lot of BS in the answer that you gave him and that you
You are
didn't
so
know.
right.
That you didn't know. But that was something that I'll never forget about Jack. He gave you that look, and it was always, "Is that right?" And
You,
that spoke
I
volumes with Jack Pearson.
thank you for that warm memory that I had forgotten. You are so
Jack
right.
was terrific. Jack was terrific. Jack was terrific.
What happened after Philadelphia?
Well, we got an opportunity, and I'm gonna, bear with me here because I don't have this thing chronologically in order.
That's
So
okay.
I'm just going to recount it the best I can here, Griff.
That's
But
what we want.
I worked in Philadelphia, and then I spent some time working for the safety department in the middle '90s. The SBUs happened, if you will recall, and
Strategic
uh,
business units.
strategic business units, and I will maintain to this day, I don't have anything other than my own experiences, but I believe that was probably the downfall of the long distance, the stature of the long distance services, and rightfully so. But that's just how I feel about all of that. I think we were the national network prior to that, and then we became four separate entities. The what became in the end, going forward, it was the headquarters entity, the Northeast Corridor, the long distance services, and then what morphed into state supported services at such and such a point in time. But it struck me that, and I went to work for the safety department at that time. Jobs were abolished, as they always are when you restructure. I went to work for the safety department. Another managerial style role, compliance and inspection and compliance, traveling the country as I did in doing audits and things of those nature, because of the background that I had and the national exposure that I had been given. And then in 1998, the service guarantee was enacted or attempted to be enacted, and that was at that point in time. I believe George Warrington had become the president of the company. He had taken over for Tom Downs.
But before we go there, because I find that part just invaluable historically, but I want to go back and thank you for what you said about the strategic business units, because let me tell you what somebody on my level saw looking back up. What happened for the first time, you hit the nail right on the head. give or take a few over the years, there's been a core of about 16 Amtrak long distance trains throughout Amtrak's history that have survived, and what happened was in the strategic business unit, and you said it out loud, perhaps in a little bit different way, for the first time ever, 16 different trains became competitors with each other instead of one Amtrak.
That's correct. And I say this, and I tell you, I use my own experiences as a way to make that statement. When I was an electrician, I'll go back to those days in Washington. It was very clear which trains outside of the Metroliners, because of their importance and what they did, it was very clear which trains were the higher priority. That was the long distance train. That was the Capital Limited. We were running 6061 to Montreal in those days with Le Pub, the old 3100 series lounge cars, if you remember those days.
I do.
Those trains had to be right. The 10 and 6 sleepers, those trains had to be right. And there was no doubt in anybody's mind it was a national network, and those trains coming in and going out, you had the silver service that would come through on our lower level at that point in time. They had a level of importance that the regular Northeast regionals and the regular Amfleet One coach trains, just didn't hold in those days. So I say what I did because when the Amtrak's personnel population was divided up, and that's what it was. It was divided up. There was a lot of resources that went into the Northeast corridor that had a broader view of the world than just that 600 miles of railroad that had wire over top of it. And I think that ultimately was I'll say this again. I think that was the downfall of, or the diminishing of the long distance services. They did become competitors, and
I wholeheartedly agree with you.
It was sad.
They came disconnected from each other, and I don't necessarily mean physically. I mean just conceptually. They were 16 different entities instead of one Amtrak.
Yeah, it became more about the cost that were associated with running that service than it did providing the level of service and that had been the focus in previous years.
That's certainly how we felt on the front lines. Yes, sir. Thank you for saying that. Okay, service guarantees. Did you have a hand in service guarantees at that?
Well, in this way.
Okay.
Brian Rosen.
I have an important question, but go ahead.
I'll do the best I can to answer it for you. Brian Rosenwald and a handful of others were appointed because service guarantees were in vogue in America in those days, and it was a way to
Barbara Richardson was marketing vice president. Okay.
Yes, and it was a way to incentivize the men and women who owned the work and who ran the railroad to put their best foot forward. And that's a crude way to put it, but I think that was one of the overarching desires at that point in time. But Brian and it must have been about 25 or 30 other Amtrak managers, Kevin Scott and Lenore Slimbach and others, George Benz and many others went on a whirlwind tour around the country and did some brainstorming at other outside venues and put a wonderful plan together that I think if it had been universally supported and such, probably would have worked. It was going to be difficult, but that's a story for another day. But at the end of the day, once that report was given to the executive committees and the executive level, there was a decision made to put a very small, I'll use the term, an implementation team together that would take these findings and try to make it part of the fabric of the way that we did business. And I found out later that the members of the team, Don Kushan, God rest his soul, who has since left, Richard Phelps, Bill Morrison, Ann Hoey, who was the lady who was put in charge of that. And I'm missing a couple. Kevin Scott was one, and some other. Well, they were apparently struggling to come up with a mechanical rep, and I got nominated. And
so that I was trying to. Okay, that explains it. All right.
Yeah. So it became one of those in our careers, Griff. When someone who of that stature normally knocks on your door and asks you if you'd be willing to help, it's like being voluntold. You don't necessarily say no. So I didn't say no. I'd be more than happy to participate. And so that's what we signed up to do. And we did that for a better part of a year or two. And again, learned an awful lot. The service guarantee and the framework around it, and the identification of those bottlenecks that existed in our operation. I think if it had been universally adopted and had been driven a little bit more vociferously, and I'll use that term, it may have netted us better results than it did, but it did. And
Matt,
I learned a lot.
May I take a moment for our viewers, Mr. Murphy? Amtrak came up with a national service guarantee policy, whereas if something wasn't right as advertised by Amtrak services, you could apply to the most common denominator with the passenger, be it ticket agent, onboard service staff, just whoever you could personally encounter, and they would make it right. And my question, of course, you had no way of knowing, Mr. Murphy, but the service guarantee was unrolled on the route of the Texas Eagle at the very same time the Union Pacific was having its 3-year meltdown merger period with the Southern Pacific.
Oh boy.
And if you will remember, 6 and 7 hour late trains were the norm.
Yes.
Not like Miss Smith will tell you to this day, we are busing experts between Fort Worth, Texas and El Paso, Texas.
Absolutely. Yep.
Her team could do that in their sleep. Yep. And that service guarantee was unrolled, ladies and gentlemen, during that time. So you can imagine how those of us frontline people on the Texas Eagle route felt about service guarantees.
I can only imagine.
Because you couldn't arm it. We couldn't be armed with enough tools to satisfy 7 and 8 hour late trains. It just
and you were given an equation that you could not win.
That is true.
You weren't going to win in that scenario.
I know what happened to service guarantees on our route. It's just the service disruptions far exceeded our ability to satisfy. But what happened to the program? How to those of us on the front line, it kind of mysteriously disappeared.
It was like a lot of efforts, Griff, that we saw, and I'm going to give you a real broad, generic answer here. So many of the programs that were rolled out during our career, they were referred to as the flavor of the month. How many times did you hear that?
Yes,
that phrase?
I had forgotten that. You are so right.
And the unfortunate part about it is when you're going to roll out a company-wide effort, and I don't really it doesn't matter how large the entity is. You need to make certain that everybody is firmly on board, and you need to make certain that it is clearly articulated and driven from the top of the organization all the way down to the ground. If the top of the organization can't convince folks, and I'm not saying that was what took place here, but if you could be an independent observer and an independent investigator for so many of the efforts that we undertook, and be a fly on the wall, I suspect at some point in any of the efforts, there became a point in time where it felt like you were a salmon swimming against the tide, and better to cut your losses than it is to persevere and push through. And I suspect at the end of the day, the service guarantee fell, and I'm sure there's more to it than that. But at the end of the day, that was like a lot of the initiatives that were attempted, and that fell through. And ultimately, I will say this because I feel strongly enough about this, that one of the shortcomings, I won't look at it as a failure or a failing, but I think one of the shortcomings that we had over the years with Amtrak is it was difficult to get the folks who did the work to believe they owned the work.
That is very true. We were thank you for saying that. You hit that nail right on the head. We were lucky, meaning people on the route of the Texas Eagle, because we had Joy Smith to tell us we owned it. And
Yes.
that's having the best of the best of the best telling you about it. And so we were lucky. But you're right. That ownership of the product did not get communicated well nationally.
And it wasn't just it wasn't just 21, 22. This was a something that was prevalent across the entire organization. And it's difficult for an organization of this size. There were pockets of it, don't get me wrong, you just described one. But when you have a military style bureaucracy, and which is top down driven, you know this, and you try to get folks to own their work, and some folks would own it, some folks would not. It's difficult for folks at certain levels to give up control. I'll go back to Bob Burke. Two things that I continue to use today were things that he shared, with me way back in the early 90s. And it's this. You'll hear me reference this again at the tail end of our get together. In order to gain control, you have to give up control.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. And how many people don't understand that?
They
a lot.
don't understand it at all. And the one thing that is as true today will always be true. I don't care whether we're 100 years in the future. If you don't care who gets the credit, you can get anything done that you set your mind to.
Amen.
It took me a while to learn that. Okay. I was a puppy when I heard those sayings.
Yes.
And they were as true then as they are today, as they will be 50 to 100 years in the future. It took a while to understand what that wise man was trying to teach me. And when it did, it was one of those, eureka moments. I get it. I truly get it. But as an organization, I didn't see, and there wasn't enough from my vantage point, belief that while you were told you owned it, you didn't believe you owned it. Because ownership conveys certain things. It's one thing to hold the job. It's one thing to come to work to do the job. but it's quite another to feel like you can put your arms around it, embrace it, and say, this is mine. And there wasn't enough of that throughout all of our careers. And I think I can get you to agree with that. If there had been more, I think the results would have been different. I really believe.
Wholeheartedly. You just eloquently put an explanation into what one of my railroad mentors taught me. And it was in the form of a question. He always would say, why would you use policy against a passenger when you can just as easily use policy in favor of them?
Exactly.
And you kind of have to be there to find, like you said, to learn that lesson. But it's easy to use. Well, you can't do that because it says you can't do that. Well, why not? Why not say why you can do something?
That's right.
It's
exactly right. And when you believe that you own something, you will 99.9% of the time go toward the positive use of the policies and the regulations. Because look, at the end of the day, you and I both know they're guidelines. And they were put in place to give folks an ability to navigate through various scenarios. If we created a rule and a policy for every single, for instance, that came up out there, that book would be 4 feet thick and you'd never be able to get through it. Okay, never. They were guidelines. But you always had that 1% of the population that used what I'll refer to as malicious compliance to always tell you, well, that's what the rule says. And to justify whatever decisions they made that didn't make a whole lot of sense when they made them. But they could always fall back on that. We had that 1%, always did.
You are so right. I'm keep bringing her up on purpose, but it just exactly what you said. I remember when she first started doing it, Joy Smith would come into her territory and she would say things like, no, I'm going to use East Texas as an example, but this could easily be said about San Antonio or Houston or Little Rock or wherever. And she would come into this territory and we'd be in a public setting. Well, check with Mr. Hubbard. He runs Texarkana, Marshall, Longview, and Shreveport and Houston with the throughway buses. The first time I ever heard it, I thought, I do.
Exactly.
What?
Exactly.
But you know what? That's how and all of a sudden, we were running our territories.
You owned it. She let you own it.
We owned it. She let us own it. But the first time I heard it, it was like, what is she? Wait a minute here.
Yeah, exactly. But if you think about this, all right, and it took a while for it to dawn on people as hard-headed as this Irishman you're talking to.
Me too.
But at the end of the day, if she had questions, who's she going to call? She's going to call you. No one knew it better than you did.
I know they didn't like it. I know, although nobody ever, I know they didn't like it. She would have procurement call us on the front lines on some big project. And you could tell the corporate procurement person is thinking, why am I talking to this guy? Because Miss Smith wanted him talking to the lowest common denominator to the operation. Is why.
To get the answers that they needed in order to be able to make the decisions that they had to make. I mean, look, when you're in the procurement department, you got the company's resources at your beck and call. So you better be using it wisely. So it makes sense to go to the folks who have the right answers. So it's
all right, sir,
hard lesson for folks to learn.
It was for me. We're in the 21st century now. Okay, and you are the mechanical representative to really the marketing team on in terms of service guarantees. So what happens next?
Well, once that got abolished and such, I went back to work in the mechanical department. Was given an opportunity, again, Stan Bagley afforded me an opportunity to retain a position and such. I worked under, and by this time, oh my goodness gracious, I cannot tell you what Mr. Vincent Nessie meant to my career. his successor, Mr. Mario Bergeron. But Vince gave me a number of assignments and eventually allowed me.
This is still mechanical?
Yeah, still mechanical.
Okay.
And allowed me to become the superintendent of standards and compliance. And we're into the 2001 and 2 time frame at that point in time, and gave me an opportunity to learn, and gave me the type of opportunity to get my feedback on the ground after having gone through the service standards initiative. And I cannot thank him enough for doing that. Vince Nessie, with that Italian heritage of his, was as straight a shooter as we have ever had, was as compassionate an individual as had ever worked in a management capacity, was straightforward, told you what he wanted, gave you more support than you could ever possibly give, gave you more feedback than you cared for when things were not quite up to the standard that he wanted them at. But boy, he drove it, and he got results that were unprecedented. He and working for a gentleman by the name of Jack Hannaford in Bear, Delaware, Vince took over the mechanical department, working for headquarters at some point in time, and all of that. And I got a chance to be part of his management team before he retired. And again, I'll say what I've already said at the risk of being redundant. Amtrak was a better organization because Vince Nessie was in it. Vince Nessie was, boy, if you could clone that son of a gun, this company could have moved mountains. He was so talented and so good. So I worked there, and then Vince retired.
Well, wait, we've got to highlight this a little bit. Being in charge of standards and compliances from the mechanical side of this company, that is a huge, tremendous responsibility they put on your shoulders, because now you've got Amtrak's liability in your hands.
That's correct. For the equipment itself now.
Yes.
We were in the early stages of putting a standard in place, of becoming more process focused, of using more what the world today calls analytics. Back then, it was the forerunner for process management, and for becoming, Deming was big in those days. Six Sigma was big in those days. Jack Welch at GE was huge in those days, and Amtrak was at the very early stages of that. We really didn't have much in the way of a standard. So Vince was at the forefront of getting that established and getting that to become part of how we did business. There were others outside. Ed Bauer with the Burlington Northern Santa Fe was one who came in and mentored us and did some real fine work for us. And I learned a lot from Ed and such. And then after that, Vince retired. We moved forward. Griff, Mario Bergeron came on board and was he was able. Vince hired Mario along with a couple of other individuals from BN and a couple of other railroads. Mario, I believe, was with CN. He was Canadian, and he came to us, and Mario put up with a real tough time. And I never, ever met anyone that was more patient and had more perseverance and was more steadfast than Mario Bergeron, because not only did he have our day-to-day running service and inspection operation around the country, he also had the engineering department. And trying to get that to become more process focused, and trying to get, because that was his world, he brought that with him, and trying to get those of us who kind of were flying by the seat of our pants and looking around saying, yeah, that'll do. No, that won't do. And to put that in place, what the mechanical department at Amtrak gets done today was in large part because of the work that Vince Nessie and then Mario Bergeron put in place back in those days. I can't begin to believe and to tell you how much I learned and how patient he was with me in those days. I was able at some point, Griff, to become, as time marched on, to become the head for him, the DCMO for service and inspection across the country. I had one of the holes that I had on my resume. Go ahead, ask your question.
DCMO stands for.
Deputy Chief Mechanical Officer.
Okay, so you were second in command.
Well, there were two or three of us. I just
Okay.
happened to have the service and inspection piece of this, which was the train piece across the entire country. One hole that I had on my resume from a divisional standpoint was referred to as a master mechanic. So in 2009, I was given an opportunity to be the master mechanic for the Central Division, headquartered in Chicago. And I worked there for the better part of about 18, 19 months. Vince retired at that point in time. Mario took over for him as the chief mechanical officer and reached out and gave me an opportunity to become his deputy in charge of the entire service and inspection operation from around the country. Chicago taught me more than I could ever possibly have learned in a support role. Our good friend, does the name Craig Willett mean anything to you?
Oh, it sure does. What a gentleman.
Well, Craig Willett brought a train in. We ran.
And what a railroad man.
Oh, one of the best engineers that you'll ever meet. We ran into a tough winter, if you recall, when everything in the Midwest froze. And I mean, it was cold. That's when we found out that the Superliner equipment had bad brakes. And it had bad brakes because one of the manufacturers had used defective equipment to rehab the brakes, and everything was good until the temperature got below zero. And in the North Dakota arena with 7 and 8 going across the top of the country and then down into Chicago, it wasn't uncommon for that period of time to see sub-zero temperatures. Daryl Pesh was the general superintendent at that point in time. On DK Pesh,
another fine man.
Oh, but he and I worked together in Washington.
I had the greatest respect for Mr. Pesh.
He was tremendous. That's why I will tell you, but with Daryl Pesh and with Tommy Farr, who went down south and worked with the auto train and the Southern Division, we had a management team that could teach you right and from wrong in any number of ways. Learned a lot from those gentlemen and hold them in the highest regard. There are more stories than I could ever possibly tell, but those gentlemen taught you how to run the railroad and how to do right from wrong. But Mr. Pesh was running the Central Division at that point in time. Well, we were delaying 7 and 8 up in the North Dakota area because that was crew change point, 1,500-mile inspection, and it wouldn't pass brake test. And we finally were able to get enough folks dispatched up there to thaw it out long enough to pass a brake test and get it down. And I will never forget meeting that train as it pulled into Chicago Union Station that one day. Train 8 pulled in and it was horribly late. And Craig got down out of that locomotive and trying to help him with his stuff out of that locomotive. And I think every square inch of that cab was covered in more blankets than he could possibly put up just in order to stay warm. I think the ambient in that doggone thing was probably 32 degrees by the time he was
Sure.
able to get it back down. But the look on his face, I will forever be grateful for Mr. Craig Willett bringing that train across the territory and coming down. It holds a special place in my heart. But those are the folks that you run across in our careers. That those were owners of the railroad. Craig
Yeah,
Willett was as good as it got.
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
He was tremendous. So at that point, right after that tenure, I went back. I ran. The service and inspection arena, all of the trains across the country. There were quite a few employees at that point in time. I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 to 3,000 employees or more from Boston all the way down to Hialeah, from Washington all the way through Chicago and Los Angeles and up and down
You must have been constantly
Coast.
on the road.
Well, you spend a lot of time on the road. You spend a lot of time helping out. You spend a lot of time trying to do what you needed to do. One thing that you can always count on with Mr. Bergeron was safety was absolutely the most important thing, and the one element that I learned and I took with me into my other arena afterwards was leadership. The mechanical department was at the forefront of what we referred to. Mario put a program in place. Vince started it. Mario took it on with the leader, what we refer to as leadership in action. And every supervisor and general foreman and management employee in the mechanical department would come into a central location for the better part of a 2 to 3 week curriculum. And they learn soup to nuts what the expectations were, what was acceptable, what was not acceptable. There were exercises that were learned. We learned what we refer to as the 8 behaviors. Empathy, all of the things that you needed in order to make the men and women that truly own the work believe that they had the level of support that they needed in order to do that. And those years, that 2000, late 2010, early 2011, all the way up through the next restructuring that we had in 2013, going back into service centers, the long distance service center.
Right.
Were invaluable. I learned so much in those days. And then in 2013, Mr. DJ Stadler, Donald Stadler, who I will forever be indebted to, and gave me an opportunity. The head of that long distance business unit was open. He had solicited candidates. I had met Mr. Stadler as a result of working directly for Mr. Bergeron, and he asked me if there was any interest on my part in taking on an effort like that, and if there was, because he was looking for individuals. Mr. Boardman was the president at that point in time, and so I applied and went through the interview process in Chicago. As a matter of fact, he and Chris Jagodinsky were the interviewers, and was fortunate enough to be given an opportunity to be the head of the long distance business line after a meeting with Mr. Boardman, and which I'm glad I did. Was able to meet Mr. Boardman and at a level and in a manner that I had not been exposed to before, and proved to be very grateful for that opportunity. One of the last of the really truly good railroaders, great railroaders, and took over the business line. Never forget the first conference call. We had the trunk line at that point in time, Griff, where you could dial into that number, and I later found out I did it from a hotel room in Chicago. I'm in my hotel room and folks dialed in and kind of laid out what I thought we could accomplish. I realized that the long distance business line was not didn't necessarily have favored nation status at that point in time, but there isn't any reason in the world why we couldn't run it safely. There wasn't any reason in the world why we couldn't take care of our customers. I remember what it was like in the 70s and 80s and early 90s in my career when customer service was valued and such. Mr. Stadler impressed upon me that those expectations were there. The old CPI and all of the other the measurements that we put in place, the corporation put in place, and kind of outline that and that we were there. We put the team together. We get the team together in Chicago in short order in order to address concerns and to lay things out. But Tom Kirk down south and Morel Savoy in Chicago and God bless Michael Chandler out west, a terrific management team. All of them were outstanding individuals. Michael had a management team that was as strong as you could ever possibly imagine. I don't have to tell you that. That was the highlight of my career running that long distance. The last years were the best. Being able to work with those men.
Having Joy Smith as your senior director.
Yes, she had been down in Texas, had come up to Chicago, and I remember some of our conversations and letting her know that the one thing that I needed her to do was to educate me and to do what she believed was in the best interest of a good customer service.
Do you know what? Let's see if you remember this. And I wish I could tell you, I can't. The years have gone by, but I'm sure it was probably at a tempo meeting or en route to or from one. But you once told me these words that I've never forgotten, and I thought so true, Mr. Murphy. You said, I have Miss Smith to keep me out of trouble where I didn't even suspect there was any. And I thought, if that doesn't define her abilities right there.
That young lady was willing to take on all of those tough tasks that no one else was willing to take on.
You got it.
You remember how much of a struggle group sales were across and they had been de-emphasized because they had struggled so mightily. And that young lady took a trip out to Riverside, sat down with Velvet Samuel and some of those young ladies out there and the head of that call center and reinstituted and re-energized that. And fortunately, Mr. Stadler was a big believer in while he expected costs to become into focus, he was also a big believer in generating revenue. There's more than one way to make the bottom line better. And he afforded us an opportunity to try to run as much of that to ground as we possibly could. Could never be any more grateful than I was for his guidance and his willingness to to put up with our experimentation in many ways. But so many people I could name, but I don't want to do an injustice to those who don't get mentioned. That was a tremendous time frame.
When you were made vice president of intercity long distance, your primary office was at Chicago Union Station, correct? Third floor, fourth floor, eighth floor?
Third or fourth floor, I think. I can't remember off the top of my head. Third floor. Doesn't matter.
Okay. I just want to know, sitting in, and I'm sure I had been in the eighth floor offices before, because those had been offices that once belonged to the presidents of the Sioux Line and the Burlington. And I mean, they were big offices with showers in them.
That
know,
was my
cruising.
introduction to Chicago when I came out there in 1990, 91. That building, Chicago Union Station, was occupied top to bottom.
Yes.
And the one thing that always struck me, Griff, the open concept was not in vogue back in those days, because you could walk down those hallways and every office door was closed. All
Yes,
that
sir.
plexiglass that served for windows that you could not see through.
Frosted.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
it was exactly frosted, and if somebody didn't open a door, you could drop a pin and hear it in those corridors. I'll never forget that introduction. But yeah, I remember that. That was mine as well.
Well, my question is, when you got in that office, and I know you didn't have very many reflective moments because you didn't have time, but did you ever once in that office kick back in the chair just for a second and say, I used to be a chauffeur for the guys that sat in these offices, and look did that ever cross your mind?
And once or twice it did, but I think it had more to do. I worked. We always, how you say you work for joy. Well,
Yes.
when you were in the mechanical department working for Mr. Bergeron, we worked for Catherine Huss. Catherine Huss. I don't know if you knew Kathy or not.
The name.
Kathy, she was phenomenal, and every once in a while, when got a little tough and you had a tough day, Kathy was real fond of when you needed a little tough love, Kathy gave you a little tough love, and when you needed a pat on the back, Kathy was good at doing that. But every once in a while, she would think about where you started, and think about what you've done, and think about what's been accomplished. And then she'd follow up with it and stop whining and go get your job done. But Catherine and Kath would every once in a while remind you that you need to stop and smell those roses and acknowledge that it's been a pretty good career, and it was an eventful journey. And I couldn't thank her enough for that, among many, many things. But the Joy Smiths and the Catherine Husses would get you in line every once in a while and remind you, as Joy does today. Still keep in touch with both of them, and to this day, just be grateful for what you've got every day that you've got.
Absolutely, amen. And sir, may I say, from somebody on the front lines of my position, what a privilege it was to work under you as Vice President of Long Distance Services. We knew you were there, and we knew you cared, and I prove it by this statement and this question. As somebody that has been involved in the effort to restore rail passenger service between Atlanta, Georgia, and Dallas, Texas since the 1970s, I went to my first meeting with Bossier City Mayor George DeMint in 1978. And Big George wasn't even the mayor of Bossier yet. Bossier City had one Holiday Inn, and he was the Holiday Inn innkeeper.
There you go.
But he had this great civic idea, and that's when we stand on his shoulders today, because he's the one that first started to bring everybody together. My question to you, and thank God it happened on your watch. How come after all of these years, if you'll notice, when you got in charge and you took an interest and Amtrak crunched the numbers 40 years later came out positive for this service? Because for 40 years, I don't think the numbers even I don't think Amtrak ever even crunched the numbers, but you took it to the touch it, see it, feel it. Here's what it'll look like.
Well, Griff, I'll go back to something I said a few minutes ago, and you got to give Mr. Stadler credit for that at its very basic level. And I say that because he gave us the latitude to go find opportunities to make the bottom line better. He didn't put restrictions in front of you, and he didn't create boundaries that limited, the brainstorming that you needed to do in order to see what was truly out there. And there were so many that and you know them much better than I do, but when you went back, it was the idea that there wasn't a connection we had a connection between New York and Atlanta, and we had a connection between New York and New Orleans. Katrina had happened a number of years, 7, 8 years, prior to that, and trying to think about rekindling that service. We got, when you realize how large Dallas was, there was no connection between a large metropolitan area in Dallas and a very large metropolitan area in New York. And it just stood the reason that if you could find a way to connect Dallas to New York, there was a market there that could be explored. So look, why not go ask the questions? And that's what we did. Just go ask the questions. And Atlanta was growing and continues to grow. I mean, you're talking 13 years ago at this point in time, Griff. Look what Atlanta is today.
Yes.
Okay, that's a leading city in the South at this point in time. Okay,
Yes.
What we realize is the Southeast. And if there was a way to connect Dallas and those millions of people with Atlanta and New York and Chicago, it certainly seemed to me it was worth exploring it. It was like trying to rekindle the Los Angeles, San Diego to Las Vegas. Excuse me, but there's 17 million people between Los Angeles and San Diego that get in a car on Friday night and drive 5 hours to Las Vegas. What if they didn't have to drive? Think they'd take the train? I think they might. But it was that type of brainstorming that Mr. Stadler encouraged. And so we just ran it to ground. And when the numbers came back, it was with, well, this might work. So why don't we run it? So we ran that special. We were a KCS delay from running that special that you knew so well from Dallas all the way over to Jacksonville. Instead, we couldn't get the KCS portion of that ironed out in enough time, and that's why that special only ran from New Orleans over to Jacksonville, because it was slated to run from Dallas to New Orleans and then along the Gulf Coast and up to Dallas. And I think if people had been able to see the groundswell of support across East Texas into Louisiana, down to New Orleans, I think that would have been all that was necessary, no doubt about it. But it was because of Mr. Stadler basically saying, look, go run it to ground. We're interested in making the bottom line of the long distance business line better, and growing revenue and making money is just as important as saving it. So you're in front of that.
You're a very humble man, but I want to put on the public record that bulb, it wasn't a seed, it was a bulb that had been planted in the 70s and kept alive but dormant all of these years. Sir, you're the one that we actually got to see some green shoots sprout up out of the ground with, thanks to your efforts. And now, as you well know, it looks like there's a significant chance that service is going to actually operate in the next few years. And you hit the nail right on the head. New York to Fort Worth is great to talk about, but the meat and potatoes is going to be Atlanta, Dallas.
Absolutely. And the markets were always there.
Always there. Sir, in your remarkable and wonderful story, and I apologize for taking up so much of your time here, but it's very important that we, in my humble opinion, that we put this on the record. Have I missed anything? Have I left anything out? I want you to have the opportunity to say what you want to say about any issue involving the railroad.
I don't know that there were any issues per se, Griff. But if you'll give me an opportunity to say thank you to all of the men and women that were instrumental in my 42 years with the railroad, I'd be grateful for that. I would not be sitting here, and you and I would not be having this conversation if it weren't for so many people who shook their head and like Vince put that pipe in his mouth and just said, "You'll
Yes.
do," and granted me an opportunity to learn and to stumble and to pick myself back up and realize the support that I was given. I would not have gotten any of this done if it weren't for all of those people. It's just I'm a byproduct of their efforts, and I couldn't be more grateful for it. Thank you for what you did, and what you continue to do, and for making everyone's job easier by owning your part of the railroad and making sure that it was as seamless as it could be.
Well,
Thank
thank you
you, sir.
for permitting it, sir. And also thank you for the very humble privilege of your friendship. I'm honored by it.
Well, let's make sure that we take that into the future, sir. It'll always be there. I'm grateful for it.
Yes, sir. Lastly, will you be available? Because I'm sure we will have some when we do air this podcast with you. People who have operating or mechanical questions or wonder about this or that, will you be available for me to contact and say a viewer has written in and asked this question, about your podcast? Well, what do we answer? If you might be available for that, I'd be grateful.
I'm always available, Griff. The phone is always on for you, sir.
You are a true gentleman, and again, I'm humbled to know you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the heart of the nation, the traveling sensation. Get your reservation today. All aboard the Eagle Way. Cut the travel hassle, catch the Iron Horse Castle. Everybody's catching the way, catch the way. The Texas Eagle Way. The way to and from and all points beyond. www.texaseagle.com. Y'all come on the way. The Texas Eagle Way. Through the heart of the nation, the traveling sensation. Get your reservation.